I got a fly this week. This is a wet fly called the Atherton No. 5. Had a longtime friend and follower who reached out to me about this particular pattern and how the dubbing was made on this. Now, I did a tying supplemental video that I released last week on how to make your own dubbing, and the focus of that was to talk about how the dubbing on this particular fly is made. And because the original recipe calls for polar bear or seal's fur, which you generally cannot get anymore, so there's some substitutes out there. And then it's a question of mixing it together. I had mixed up two different batches of this. One of them was done by hand, which the colors aren't quite as uniform, and the other was done inside of a coffee grinder. And I refer you to that video to see that. But that dubbing ended up being a little bit more uniform. So I tied two different flies for this video. This one was tied with the mix of dubbing from the coffee grinder, and the other fly that I tied, which I show in the video a little bit more, was actually tied with the dubbing that I mixed by hand. Can't really tell much of a difference between them, but like I said, mixing by hand often it's not quite as uniform and homogeneous as with the coffee grinder. But in the process of mixing that dubbing up, I thought it would be nice to just do a video on how to tie the Atherton No. 5. This one I am, instead of using bronze mallard in the wing or Bali duck, which the original recipe calls for, I'm using some dark teal. So that's the Atherton No. 5, and I'll get started. Got my hooking device for the Atherton No. 5. This is a Mustad 3399 in a size 6 standard wet fly hook. I'll go ahead and debarb the hook. There's no tip or tag on this, so I'm going to start by applying my thread. I'm using a Danville 6/0 in white. Even though it is a dubbed body, I don't want to darken that down at all. So I'm just going to go ahead and stick with the white color to have kind of a nice white base to it. Get my thread down the end of the shank, just past the point of the hook, and I'll tie in the tail. Now the tail calls for a number of different things. Actually, I should say the whole fly calls for a number of different materials. In the recipe, it calls for bronze mallard. Rather than using the bronze mallard, I'm going to go with some dark teal. And the reason is I'm using dark teal in the wing instead of Bali duck. In the recipe, it says you can substitute either some dark teal or mallard flank with this. So I'm going to go ahead and just use some dark teal on this. I'm going to select maybe half a dozen 8 barbs off of a nice long feather like this. Get those tips evened up, peel those off. Try to roll those together a little bit. Doesn't have to be super thick, you just want to have enough for a tail. I'm going to tie that in about a shank length long. As I secure that in, I'm going to work my way down the hook shank just a little bit more. And I'll trim the excess the length of the body. There is a rib on the Atherton No. 5, and it is a small oval gold tinsel. I'm using a Danville size 14 oval gold tinsel. If I were doing this on, say, a size 4 hook, I'd probably go with the size 10 tinsel. I'm going to tie that in. You don't want to try and bring this up underneath the thread and slide it around under the thread, because the metal that is the tinsel on the outside of there can actually cut your thread. It won't really won't pull and slide around that well. Put a little bit of wax on my thread. And now we're going to dub the body. The body is this dubbing that I mixed up in the tying supplemental video on making your own dubbing. And in that video, I did two different versions of this. I showed how you can just pull the dubbing apart, stack it up on itself, and keep pulling it apart to hand mix it. But then you can also mix it in a coffee grinder. The hand mixing doesn't come out quite as uniform, and some people prefer that because they like having some spots with different colors or other colors that are more pronounced instead of all homogeneous. The coffee grinder will tend to get you something a little bit more homogeneous. Now I'm going to go ahead and do the body here with the dubbing that I did in the coffee grinder just to show you. And then I have one tied up, a completed fly that I did with the dubbing that I mixed by hand. So you can kind of compare apples to oranges in terms of the effect of each one. They really don't look all that different. But you want to just put a medium-sized body on here. I like to put a little bit of a taper working from the back forward, making it a little bit thicker as we go on up the body towards the wing. Because I think a lot of these flies look better this way because they are being made to either represent some sort of a drowned insect and or a bait fish or something like that. So having that taper, I think, helps. I'm going to trim away some of these extra long fibers. Five wraps for our rib. And that is our Atherton number 5 with the coffee grinder mixed dubbing. You can see you've got some spots, a little gray right there, maybe a little more reddish right there. I don't think it really affects the fly as much. It is just a little bit different. This is the completed one that I did that has the dubbing that was mixed by hand. And I imagine I probably should have just not put the color on there so you could see that a little bit better. But it really doesn't look that much different in the completed fly. Some people do like I said, the mixing it by hand and you don't have it as uniform. They like that effect a little bit better. So it's up to you either way. I'm going to clean this up a little bit and change over to my black thread using a Danville 6/0 in black. Some wax on my thread, get a little bit more grip, and change over to this, and then we'll tie in our wing, which is going to be some dark teal, and then the hackle, which is collared and is a brownish dun color. Again, smoothing this off, cleaning it up just a little bit. Now I'm in position to tie in my wing. Again, the recipe calls it you can substitute some dark teal for the wing. So I selected a feather that it gives me nice uniform sides to the left and the right, like this, and I clipped out the center of that, and then I will fold those two sides together to make the wing like such. Tie that in so the tip is about halfway down the tail. Get in a half dozen wraps to secure it, and we'll take a look at our wing. Wings don't have to look exactly perfect, because as soon as you start fishing it, all of this is going to get kind of all scattered and, I don't want to say busted up, but not going to be all uniform flowing through the water like that. So I don't get too bent out of shape. If you're going to be framing this and giving this to somebody else, then you might take a little bit more care in terms of getting the shape and position of the wing exactly the way you want it. Trim away the excess on the wing. Smooth this area off. And this just gives me a nice area for wrapping in the collar, the hackle. As I said, it calls for kind of a brownish dun color, which is, dun is usually going to be, it's spelled D-U-N, by the way, not D-O-N-E, but a dun color is kind of a grayish bluish color. So what they're looking for is a brownish kind of feather that has a little grayish blue in it. Fortunately, I happen to have a hen neck that has that. It may not look quite grayish blue on the camera, but it does have that in there. I think if you use a light brown or even like a ginger or a mottled kind of ginger, I think it would work just fine. Now, I've got a little bit larger feather on this because of this size hook. These barbs down here towards the end of the feather are going to be the last ones wrapped in. So I want to make certain that those are the right length from behind the eye of the hook to just past the point of the hook. I don't need all of this around the very tip. So I'm going to stroke these barbs backwards, isolating a lot of this tip out, because I only need to get 2 to 3 wraps of that whole feather to create the collar that I want. I'm going to get a wrap or two in to secure it, fold that tip back, and then get another wrap or two in to secure that. I can then take this tip here and just pop that off. Smoothing all of that out, I'll get my thread down behind the eye of the hook. I'll now use my hackle pliers wrapping this in. Like I said, I'm going to get 2 to 3 wraps, and that's about it. And there's my second wrap. My third's going to end up right up here by the eye of the hook. I bind in that rachis, securing it, and then stroking all of that back. I'm going to start working my way away from the eye of the hook backwards. And notice I'm wrapping up on the rachis as well as all those barbs. And I'm getting the collar so that it is flared backwards and not collared out like in a perpendicular, like in a dry fly. Let me see, I get my head made. I'm going to check everything. Yep, it's all covered up. Now I'll flatten my thread out. I'll put in an 8 or 9 turn whip finish. Smoothing all of that off, and then trim away my thread. Some head cement on here, and then come back with some black lacquer in a minute, and our Atherton No. 5 will be complete. It's a handsome little wet fly. I think this could represent a number of different things in the water. Certainly it would be a good trout fly, but I think you could throw this in any of your panfish and bass ponds and probably pick up definitely some panfish, if not some smaller largemouth or smallmouth bass. The major focus was the dubbing video on how to make the dubbing for this, and I talk more about the recipe and the materials that are in the dubbing. But I just figured while I was doing that, talking about this particular fly, I would go ahead and tie it and do a video on it. So that's the Atherton No. 5. Thanks for watching today.
Thanks for joining me at Devise today. I hope you learned at least a new pattern, if not a new technique, maybe a tip or trick here and there. If you have any questions about this fly or any of the techniques used in constructing this pattern, please leave them in the comments section down below. If you go to the trouble to ask a question, I'll go to the trouble to answer it. If you'd like to help dressed irons, please share this video with your friends and anybody you think that might enjoy this pattern. Until next time, remember, it's fly tying. If you're not having fun, then you're doing it wrong.